Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wa salatu wassalamu ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa ashabihi ajma'in. Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to Conversation with the Author. Thank you for joining us at the Islamic Literary Society, where we endeavor to promote Islamic literature. This is done in multiple ways: book launches, book publication, but more directly, as we are today, by talking to authors and hearing their thoughts on their work and other literatures. We are joined, by the grace of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, with a very thought-provoking author of a very interesting book, Radical Skin, Moderate Mask, De-radicalising the Muslim and Racism in Post-Racial Societies. Dr.Yassir Morsi, ahlan wa sahlan bikum. Welcome to our program. Jazakumullah khairan for making time for us. It's a very small book, however, a book that does a lot, mashallah. Only 186 pages or so, and a book with some fantastic chain. Dr. Morsi is a lecturer at La Trobe University, teaching gender, sexuality, and diversity. Is that correct?
Yes, well, but partly, yes. But first of all, wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Barakallahu feekum for the invitation. And yes, I work in a couple of places, and that was my, yes.
Okay. Okay, alhamdulillah. Dr. Morsi, I wanted to ask, before we even start, our brightest mind in the West, as children of diasporas, our brightest mind, much detriment of our community actually, become doctors and engineers. We do not go down the social sciences, we do not go down the humanities. I am, alhamdulillah, I'm somebody who did go down the humanities route, and I was very privileged to be able to do so. However, tell us about your experience. Tell us, how did you, mashallah, end up in the social sciences, and what led you to where you are today, alhamdulillah?
Yes, alhamdulillah, very similar. My father, who raised me alone in the West, basically put pressure on me similarly to becoming one of three things. His ideal would have been a medical doctor, and then a lawyer, or an engineer. And,
yes.
I never had the aptitude for that, I think, but khair, my path took a different one. I wasn't the best of students, I think, but without getting into the details and embarrassing myself and my wife, I will spare the audience 10-year struggle, I guess, before I will return back to university post September 11. And I think I had questions, the world around me had questions, and statements that were made and forthcoming and rushing towards me. And I found myself increasingly political in nature, and wanting to talk back, wanting to understand. And I had, I guess, a fundamental or foundational commitment to Islam and being Muslim. It brought me closer to my deen by the grace of God. It wasn't something that pushed me away. And as a result, I had a kind of fork in the road. One part of me wanted to return to what we can call the traditional sciences, to understand the foundations of our deen. Another part of me wanted to understand, for the lack of a better term, the ilm of the dunya, you know, the sciences of the world, the things that are around us. And I think because I grew up in that political furnace of intense Islamophobia, or heightened Islamophobia, I chose to go back to study humanities. And I wanted to study politics and Western philosophy to understand, to understand them, understand me, understand the world I lived in. And alhamdulillah, it changed, by the will of God, my trajectory, everything. You know, so without, I mean, this is, you know, I plan, you plan, we plan, Allah's the plan. I ended up through that path of university, getting married, finding the community again, becoming closer to my religion, all as a result of that day.
Yes, as they say, you know, Allah is the best of planners. With the idea of, you know, the higher education, to what extent, you know, you could draw parallels or direct lines to the importance of how education, higher education in particular, contribute to the betterment of the Muslim life. And when I say Muslim, it's not even, we can look at both ways, and it can be the community, but it can also be as an individual. And I think you've spoken you've touched into it already. I'd love to hear your thoughts about kind of the relationship between education and self-betterment.
Yes, it's crucial, I believe. We do not have the luxury, I think, of living in the West and being politically illiterate or ignorant or stagnant. If anything, we need to be pursue excellence in all fields and endeavors, in particular around the humanities, I think, because there has been, as you mentioned earlier, maybe historically a deficiency. We have relied on Islam, alhamdulillah, and this is absolutely necessary to provide our humanities, if you will, a sense of almost all political ideologies and paradigms have within it a moral imperatives and directions and compasses for us to pursue our idea of what is just. So yeah, but I think while growing up in the West, there was also perhaps an imperative to understand our surroundings, to understand the way we're talked about and the way we talk. And in particular, and probably because of so much misinformation and the way that misinformation is politicized, weaponized, that led directly to wars and deaths and displacements of Muslims and others around the world. I see it, education as a re-education, as a stripping free of the miseducation. So there's a double side to this, because the educational institutions may, if for the lack of a better term, create you ideologically committed to the free market and the state, or to see our purpose as being integrated into the existing status quo. But then there are strands of education, I think, that can strip away the way you've been taught about things. I believe it has to be coupled and intertwined with a solid foundation in your deen. It's not necessarily the case that your aqidah would be corrupted by studying humanities, but there may be principles of the religion that get challenged by the environment of the university. But I think we as a generation are navigating that well. I don't want to be an alarmist and create the idea that if you study humanities and your Islam will be challenged. It's not, I don't think that's necessarily the case, but education for me is my site of fighting. That's my site of where I oblige, I hope, to my duty as a Muslim to speak as much truth as I understand it. But you said something interesting. I'm sorry for over talking, but there was about Muslim and Muslim communities. And I think I chose the path of studying the Muslim condition in the West, what sometimes I call the Muslim question, coupled, I'm sure many of you already know, and some of you may remember intensely, but there wasn't a day that went past in the media or politicians or at the university lecture theatre and halls where Islam and Muslims weren't brought up. Every part of our life, of the whole cycle of being Muslim, from the way we dress to what we eat to how we pray to who we pray to, what our laws are, how we marry, what we wear, what our women wear, our women, all the above. The length of our beard, who we're hanging out with, even the food we eat. So I'm sure,
especially the food we eat.
Yeah, so all of that was under interrogation. So I think it was important to understand why, how, and to talk back.
Do you have an issue wherein the spaces wherein these discussions are being had, there is an absence of Muslims, and that particularly links to this deficit of humanities kind of in that space where that is being discussed? For example, if you think of a lecture hall wherein the lecturer is promoting these views and is talking about Islam, there is no one really within that group who is who's capable or is even attending this lecture at that point to be able to answer it. And regardless, I mean, if our listeners are engineers, doctors, they've chosen to do STEM or humanities, questioning and asking questions is something that we should be doing anyway as Muslims. And I think you mentioned that our beliefs will get challenged, but it's only by folding metal over and over again and putting it with fire that it becomes strong. Otherwise, it just becomes brittle. And a parallel could be drawn to our faith as well. And it comes down to the importance of reading per se. So on that thought, kind of the importance of reading.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's the absence, to the first part of your question, the absence of Muslim voices or Muslim presence in conversations, in particular when it's about Muslims, not necessarily just about that, but around major symbols that are challenged by humanities, like justice, equality, freedom, peace, when and how violence is necessary. Our religion directs us to all of these. And so it's important that we're there. It's important, especially when we're spoken about. But in some cases, we are there, but we are under the compulsion and the pressure and the ideological, gravity of conforming, integrating, echoing what we assume to be the right thing to say. Yeah.
Quite nicely lead us to your book.
Yes.
It would be the first mask, as you said, the fabulous mask. However, before we kind of move right into it, I'm sure many of our viewers have not quite understood or read the book. So could you kind of briefly outline the thesis of the book, and also kind of the three masks, which I thought was very nicely done with Fanon and kind of this.
Yes.
So please, if you could elaborate on that.
So the book comes out of a tracing, if you will, or a need to look at the pressures for Muslims to respond to September 11 or the war on terror. And it kind of took an autobiographical approach, not completely, but partly, whereas to see the various different types of, let's say, masks, which I called masks, I got from, as you mentioned, Fanon. So before I identify those masks, maybe a little bit of background work on the kind of traditions that led to my book. The first one is the experience of being Muslim. That tradition, although it's not articulated in text and so forth, it was the result of speaking to multitudes of Muslims in the Muslim community. It's being Muslim yourself. It's learning about our anxiety, wording out frustrations, and in some cases rage at the injustices and fears, and maybe in some cases disapprovals of the way the Ummah is dealing with these issues, and recognition of the need for stronger voices, all the rest. We were surviving, prospering, and there's always a lateral violence. The violence comes from above, but it spreads sideways, and fighting each other, in many ways, right? That was one source of, that's what I wanted to tap into more than other sources. But I was directed and informed by a long tradition of those speaking back to racism, if you will, and Islamophobia. So the two main teachers in that sense that I relied on were Fanon and Edward Said. And Edward Said was interesting because I went through 3 different readings of Edward Said. One where I, he said yes, another one where I said no, and then a third one I said maybe, right? So the book goes through those tracing of how I, as a Muslim, enjoyed Edward Said.
I think that's most of us with Said. He can be very frustrating and very liberating at times. Yes, I think that's compared Said to Fanon. It's very interesting. Your two murabbis, as you say, they became Said and Fanon. So with the 3 masks, I thought that was very interesting as well.
So I got this from Conrad, another thinker, but it was basically about the 3 relationships the colonizer had with the colonized lands, if you will, or 3 phases upon which, because there was a caricature, and this is what I've always disliked. There is a caricature of the West and the violence it does to us as, it's not evil in that sense. We characterized it as a pure aggression and dislike, and it's far more sophisticated. It tells us how to be loved. It tells us how to be welcomed. So there's a multiplicity of various techniques and tools upon which racism and coloniality work. And there was three phases around this. And the first one is the fabulous one, when the colonizer first visits. And I use these three phases as masks. So when the colonizer first visits the colonized, there's a sense of exoticness around the colonized, right? There's streets and people and food and landscape and whatnot is different. And it requires some type of translation for the white folk back home to speak about the exotic dangers and of, rolling sand dunes and apparently flying carpets and all the rest, right? So that's where Said came into it, about that kind of Orientalist fantasy about the Islamic world. So there was this we're a fabulous other, we're an exotic other, we're an other of great intrigue, beautiful but dangerous landscape and people. So that's the first contact, if you will, of the colonizer with the colonized. And as how the way it works and I'll just run through the three masks as I define them. The first mask is this compulsion, if you will, to perform the role of the fabulous, to speak of Islam as this familiar but strange, exotic, like you would say things like, oh, we have democracy, since we have shura, right? So we would try to translate
almost apologetic.
Yes.
The vibe that I got was almost kind of this apologetic Muslims, like, yes, master, but we have something which is equally fantastic.
Yes, I should say all three masks in one way or form are apologizing in one way or form.
Yes,
the fabulous is the most clear example of that, right? In one way or form, they were all trying, this is where I got my understanding from Fanon, we're all trying to perform something for the white gaze, for the ones that stare back at us. We're all trying to provide for them a version of Islam that allows us.
It is palpable.
Yes.
I wrote palpable
exactly.
when I saw the word fabulous, so that they can digest.
Yes.
Without upsetting their stomach too much. So,
exactly.
It's like tone down the chilies and tone down the spices just for the person to be able to enjoy it.
Absolutely, because you think about what one of our threats was. I mean, I've written about this elsewhere. I'm not sure in my book, but one is when we become undecidable. Is the Muslim a friend or an enemy? Where we grew up in the West, we have British or Australian or American accents. We know we're familiar with the terrain, and there is this post-racial fantasy in the West that they're not racist and they accept all different cultures and multiculturalism, this and that, social cohesion here and there. And the Muslim comes and looks like you or I, and where politics is aligned differently. Are we a threat? And so this kind of zombie figure, both a living, dead thing, undecidable, friend, foe, it needs to be resolved. And a vast majority of us wanted to resolve that by removing what you call the malignant parts so we can be palatable. I'm friend.
Perceived malignant parts.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that means we continually had to justify. And the fabulous mask is a translation. It's constantly translating things about Islam into an exotic sameness, so so the best example of these was like these hashtags, my jihad, and jihad became about kind of like pop psychology, personal help thing, like jihad means my struggle to overcome my daily routine, right? So or to not be frustrated when the bus is late. So there was always this translations of great Islamic principles, axioms that were emptied out of its own Islamic tradition and discourses, hollowed and presented back in a translated form that basically said, you and I are same, but I'm fabulously different, right? And there was that we're same but different appeal to liberalism's appreciation of equality, but celebration of diversity, and it fitted into that kind of liberal fantasy. So that was the first mask. The second mask, however, the war on terror wouldn't allow just that. It wouldn't allow you just to be different. The war on terror also wanted you to commit to a side politically, right, to fight back. And we used to get phrases like, okay, if you're so moderate, if you're so part of us, tell us basically where the radicals are, tell us where the terrorists are, and we were employed. Part of the war on terror was to employ us into the fight. right, to help us fight other bad Muslims. Yeah, so the good was good Muslim, quote unquote, was asked to fight the bad Muslim, quote unquote. So the second phase is also coincides with the second contact. The colonizer now has to fight those who are colonized who fight back, and they employ, as all colonialism has, they employ the indigenous and the native to help them do the fighting. So there's a native informant. There are those who, there's no way an East Indian company, for example, would be able to control all of that without the employment and use of the locals, right? So there has to be an employment of Muslim fighting Muslim, right? And then this is the militant mask that we chose to wear. And this is because this was the military expansion now of colonialism. First is the discovery, the exoticness, we want the love of the land. And then there is the military phase, which we're most common with, right? And that is to fight the perceived malignant element manifest into those bad Muslims. And that mask is often us showing, and this is another apology, like we're against terrorism. I am of humanity. I believe in justice. What Al-Qaeda did, what ISIS did, what all of these groups that had been associated with the epitome of backward / Islamic / Eastern violence that had no, they were arbitrary and so forth. We have to distance ourselves, not only just distance ourselves, but commit ourselves to a fight against it, right? And if you didn't commit yourself, there's no gray area here. If you didn't commit yourself to it, you'd have a question mark above you. So if you got asked a question, do you believe or do you know that terrorism is a response to colonialism? Even a question like that, and many of us do believe possibly there's cycles of violence. If you got asked that question and you didn't say a resounding no terrorism, you'd be So there was this later on, I think books and points were written, but about condemn or be condemned, right? So you had to condemn terrorism. So the militant mask speaks of that. And the third mask is the triumphant mask. It's the victory of the colonizer, where they have now taken the land, but also instituted a rewriting of history and values that the colonized now are better off for it, right? So we've introduced democracy and enlightenment values and the science, and your women are free and all the rest, right? So the triumphant mask is when we over-identify with the West as the victorious civilization and culture, and we're grateful for it, right? So we say, the problem with the world, the Muslim world back there, is it lacks democracy, it lacks human rights, and maybe there is definitely abuses there, right? But we over-identify through a paradigm of explaining all of the Muslim world's, let's say, political deficiencies, quote unquote, whatever, with the absence of Western values, right? So we don't
everything bad is a result of too much Islam and too little West.
Yes, exactly.
Everything good is a result of too much West.
Yes,
and as least Islam as we can. It's very interesting, especially I mean, when I was kind of tapping the book, I got it's very interesting. You talk about the three masks, but in Islam we also have the three nafs. We have the perfect nafs, the self-reproaching nafs, and the lost nafs. And you could say you could draw some very small parallels to that without getting too Islamically bogged down in kind of the theology of it, but kind of like the triumphant mindset. How do you decolonize that? I mean, how do you tackle that?
So I should say this. I mean, one of the other things that I was tracing in my book is myself, and I think I give a story about the consequences of colonization on the diaspora. One of many of us have, if you will, inherited triumphant mask wearing parents. I say it that way, right? Not all of us, but
no, you're right. It's very true. I mean, you only have to look at the colorism within the subcontinent, and you only have to look at there's so many points that we can pick out. to be able to identify the
so it was really important for my father to train me in secular values, for lack of a better phrase. I don't think he did it purposely, but these were now commonsensical. The West had won so emphatically that what became common sense was just Western ideals and values. And one of those things is, participate in it. So, and coupled with the value systems that you talk about, the standards of beauty, the standards of success, what constitutes respect for families were slowly but surely defined by material symbols grounded in Western culture. Like, I think there's Egypt is one of has the most Mercedes or something like that. I heard when I was growing up in the it just because even if you're materially poor, we still seek wealthy symbols that are grounded in the Westernese, right? So so there was all these pressures, and one of the things that happened as a consequence to many of us, not all of us, and many parents, alhamdulillah, deserve the due praise that they get for trying to protect the children's religion, but many of us we just grew up as Muslim nominally, sort of thing. We were. And one of the things that I struggled with is that I knew I was Muslim. There was something inside of me. There was as I said, a foundational commitment. When I hear the adhan, parts of me is drawn to it. But I wasn't taught much, right? I was basically taught how to pray and then off you go, okay? We used to do our Ramadan and that was it. And so when I came back to this, as I said, I wanted to seek knowledge, but I had what I kind of analyzed as a broken Islam, was partial Islam, was bits and pieces here and there. I knew nothing of how the fiqh was put together. I knew nothing about the chains and so forth. So then I find myself trying to grasp, as you mentioned, a language that is mine, a divinely inspired, revelatory language infused into the various different traditional texts that speak about the humanities. Without knowing the language, both Arabic or otherwise, right? So, I mean, my Arabic is Egyptian and it's broken, and it's a typical story of the diaspora, I think. So, one of the challenges is, well, how do you solve this? What's decolonial, to answer your question? How do you take off the triumphant mask? And if I take it off, what's there? And I kind of half joked in the book that the only Islam that I knew was an Orientalist one. I knew it was wrong, but it was the only one that I inherited. Right? So then in the absence of not knowing, if you will, an authentic traditional Islam, but only knowing a negative Orientalist Islam, how does one decolonial? And I think there are multiple ways we can, and one of which is coming closer to our tradition, another way of which is infusing our tradition with, I guess, senses of urgency and about humanities and what's going on. So, but the other is, because I also work now as a psychologist as an Islamic school, it's instilling confidence in our next generation to know who they are, to be able to discover, assert, speak back to that white staring gaze and say, I know who I am. To say, lakum dinukum waliya dini, I'm not, and that confidence requires all sorts of different methods. Now, all of this is at the personal level. Decoloniality also is at the collective systematic level, and that is a different that's a different question, which requires leadership and mobilizing of the economies and
re-education.
Institutional change.
A huge campaign of sometimes we do feel like when it's started by whomsoever, but we do a fine job in continuing this self-oppression, this self-depreciation, this self-loathing that we have. If we kind of move away from the triumphant mask, because I do want to kind of tap into both. With the fabulous mask, could it be that a lot of Muslims, and I don't say in particular the diaspora per se, the second generation, me and you, for example, but the older generation, that they would do it in order to fit in, and not necessarily because this is something that they want to do. So, and it's like, alhamdulillah, I mean, dad doesn't really do it because he doesn't really need to. But I know incidences where, for example, people who are of the older generation, they would put on their government voice, as you say. So when they would be speaking over the phone, they would try to hit that Queen's English a little bit more and try to, just so they don't get taken for a fool or whichever. We don't do that. As the younger generation, we're very proud. And this is from a London background. We're very proud of where we're from, and we're very kind of like, well, I'm from I'm from East London, by the way. So with our Cockney and our, et cetera, but with the old generation, you didn't have that much. Is there an element of that in the sense where
yeah. Look, growing up, I go through a kaleidoscope of emotions with respect to the relationship my father had with the West. And there's solidarity, but then there's anger and there's frustration, and easy to highlight what he didn't do, ignore what he did do. But Dad went through a lot to survive and navigate the racism, and their idea of prosperity was survival, really. It was, and they were part of the generation that built the first mosques and built the first halal butchers and so forth, at least here. And that is a necessary phase. It's absolutely. It came at a cost. It comes at a price, and it's up to us to be able to recognize that. And I go back to an early comment you made. I think we now need to move into creating more robust institutions beyond the mosques, or integrate the mosques into these institutions. Higher education institutions.
Within the kind of with the base that our forefathers have put down.
Yes. Yeah.
Rebuilt on it, and it's very interesting, but it's kind of like that continuous loop, isn't it? So where our forefathers came from, they came from a very strong, very proud, kind of people, as we say. And then they came here. It was brought down. It was tore down, and then we kind of trying to get that loop again, and trying to come back to, for example, not even our grandfathers, our great grandfathers, and that pride and that love that they had for their traditions, their faith. And it's very interesting because kind of we are going back in order to go back to what our forefathers left, essentially. With the militant mask, and it's kind of what I want to kind of spend most of the debate, the discussion, sorry. It's a very interesting concept. It's a very interesting concept. And what struck me, and preaching to the choir, but kind of the Malcolm X theory, when he was talking about the house slaves and the field slaves, and how the house slaves are more than happy to be where they are, because they are part of the oppression. They are part of the ones who serve, and they are given some luxuries and the nice little handkerchief and the nice little dress, and they're very happily kept into that place, whereas the field slave never got this. But in particular, it's used by the so-called scholars, which are used by the state to keep Muslims in check. And in your opinion, would you say that these scholars are aware that they are being used by the state, or is it very much kind of this
combination? And I think it depends on the scholar that we're speaking about. I do think that some I'm going to have to leave this for other scholars to debate other scholars. I will speak about my relationship with the ulama, if you will, of the mashayikh here in Australia. I had that question all the time. Do they know? Are they willing? Some of them, right? So there are definitely, because I know this, there is an employment by the state, the Western state, to use our scholarly cast, alhamdulillah, to look, the state was involved in, let's say, for the lack of a socially engineering the community to fit into its interests. that includes employing us into its military campaign, its economic campaign, its ideological campaign, its education campaign. And it doesn't stop there. It wants now into the campaign of reformulating an Islam that is acceptable to its political interests.
But is that something we've done by the people who are doing it? If we take, let's say, if we say on a in a group study of 10, how many of them are actively aware?
Okay, so there is that pressure, and I would say if I out of 10, I would say probably half. I don't know, Allahu Alam, but I don't want to. But yes, Allahu Alam. I do think some of them are ideologically aligned with the state, the Western state. I do believe that. I absolutely think that they're fighting us on behalf of the state.
For those who are ideologically aware, what are the kind of worldview do you think these so-called scholars have taken to justify their cooperation against the interest of Islam?
There's two battlefronts, I think. There's one which I think we as Muslims can do as a collective, and that is to enhance the conversation, the discourse around this to a degree where they're held accountable by virtue of the increase in education in the public space. So the more and more Muslims are aware of the violence integrated into the way the state functions, the more and more we can hold all leaders accountable, because we're aware now more, right? There has always been throughout the history of the construction of the Western state a necessity to keep the population politically illiterate, right?
Yes.
More we are, this is the first battlefront. The more we are politically literate, the less likely it is that we will be able to be manipulated.
Is that a racial, ethnic thing, or is that more of a class thing?
Both. They intersect. So I do think the class, this system can't work without the political illiteracy. So the more people are unaware about the fact that they're not working in their own interests, the better. Now, when it comes to racialized minorities or other minorities, it's coupled with racism, because we don't want, the other, if you will, to have too much power and knowledge of what's going on. There's a reason why we're here. There's a reason why they want us here. And so, there is, race intersects with class often, but I do think, but if you and I were to make it in this system, there is going to be some form of compromise that we have to make, in form of the way we speak, dress, whatnot, right? Or think and believe, right? Or the version of Islam that we have to reformulate to be palatable and acceptable or trusted with power, right? So there's no way I can make it in the Australian military or whatnot without making significant work on getting the institution to trust me more, right? Then so there's that. But the second part of the battlefront is there are scholars, for lack of a better term, they need to be challenged by other scholars.
Okay, kind of, I mean, we don't want to go into age, but I was 6 years old when 9/11 happened. Many of our viewers would be around the same age. My wife was born in 1999. She's going to kill me for revealing her age, but she does not know a world post 9/11, or pre 9/11. Those who have lived 9/11, there was kind of really high tension in 2001, 2002, 2003. Then, after 2008, kind of went down. Obviously, the discourse is still there. If you were to ask me, as an individual, somebody who's born and brought up in the UK, and this is reflected by many of my peers as well, we don't know a life beyond. We are very much, we don't feel like the other. Yes, there might be contradictions with our faith. We might struggle, for example, when everybody's going out for after work drinks and we're not joining them. But that's something that we navigate quite easily, and we've the children of the poor are very hardened, and they're very kind of, well, I will get through meritocracy, and I have hope that I will be able to go through. That's not always the case, but
It's
where do you put us? That
a very good question. It's a very good question. There's a couple of responses that come to mind. First of all, I think part of what doing humanities is studying history. And history is a branch of humanities. And I think it's important that we archive, and we do to an extent. I mean, it's not, but to continue that tradition of archiving our Muslim growth, struggle, prosperity, victories.
Don't get me wrong.
Yeah.
It's not because of 9/11 that we've become the other. We were always the other.
Sure.
The Rushdie case, when the 9/11 happened, after 9/11, Charlie Hebdo happened, we're always kind of the other. But what I'm trying to get at is, to what extent those who are living in the West are aware that we are the other?
Well, we're losing it. And this is why I find the question really interesting, because we are, the political temperature is different now, right?
Much different.
There's a generation that you're speaking to, and you mentioned age, where I look around and the conversation is really, really different. And there's more comfort with being, let's say, Australian, British, American, whatnot, in the West, right? And like you said, and I find this, I'm going to be honest with you, some of it problematic. And the reason why I find it some problematic is that the great struggle now is how to, there you are, West Ham United supporter.
There you go. So it's one of those things. That's the kind of thing. I was just trying to fix my, because it was a bit loud. It's what we're talking about. I mean, and this is when the problematic comes into it. West Ham United has always been associated with kind of hooliganism, etc., etc. We've had a very racist fan base, but it's changed. It's in the heart of Stratford. I've been to games for my whole life. I'm very much in the West.
You grew up in Stratford, yeah?
I grew up in and around East London, yeah.
Yeah, I was born in the UK and I grew up in East London as well. Oh, yeah.
Okay, whereabouts?
I think Stratford. I was very little. There's this commission flats, Denison Point, something like that. And I grew there. I went to Carpenter's Boys.
Yes. Carpenters, that would be Stratford. So I grew up on the other side, but just kind of that kind of thing. So and it's where are we? Where is that generation? Are we fabulous? Are we militant? Or are we triumphant? Because we do not view ourselves as the other. We do not see ourselves as outside of that.
I would say it's a good question. Maybe we're a generation that can not wear the mask at times, but learn how to very comfortably slip on the masks at different moments in our day, right? So we all joke that we know we have our government voice, our white voice, we know how to perform in particular places. We can navigate it better, I think. But here's the problem. Here's the thing. The war on terror the war on terror was always designed to create more security for the West, right? Always designed. One of the needs to create more security in the West is to pacify and integrate the Muslim community in the West, right? One of the needs was to provide space. So a lot of concessions were done in that sense. But if we look at the war on terror on a global level, the consequences on the Muslim world outside of the West is ongoing, and it has always been. We had, like, all of the tyrannical regimes that are neither Islamic or democratic, right? I don't know what they're somewhere in between, right? Not even between, I don't know what they are. We'll leave that for another debate. Have used the war on terror, take Egypt as an example, to strengthen its hold against dissidents, right? We are seeing now one have to look at contrast Ukraine to Syria or Ukraine to anything to know about the value of Muslim lives, right? And so one of the consequences of the war on terror has been, for us in the West, maybe we got a little bit of, not necessarily, I'm going to put a question mark about this. Maybe we learned, maybe we got a little gain, maybe we won a few small victories. We lost the big ones, we lost the battles. But if we look at the Ummah globally, And the frustration I have is that we've had what I call a conservative turn, and I've got nothing wrong. I don't like progressive Islam at all. It's part of the reason why I did what I did. But the conservative turn sometimes isolates us to focus on what is immediate in our lives. Interpersonal relationships, family, career, community spaces, and so forth. And that is, mashallah, wonderful. I want us to strengthen these things. But there's a question, at what expense does it come? Are we now regressing? Because we need a political imagination that ties our action to the global ummah, because we in the West succeed at the expense of somebody, right? That's how wealth is, you know.
That's a very, I think, and this kind of lead exactly to kind of what I was thinking, in the sense where we can't be a Muslim without the Ummah.
Mm.
And what the West has done very successfully is be able to make us think that you as a Muslim and the average person who's living in the West are more similar than you and Muhammad, who's living in Egypt.
Yep.
And they've done that very successfully.
Well, that's the integrationist project at one level. I mean,
yes.
we got it depends where you are. France is different from the UK. They have different pictures of secularism and expectations, multiculturalism, social cohesion. These were all branded. We had to prevent pro-CVE. All of this stuff was effectively a way to socially design a Muslim community in the West that was at one of two things. You can have, this is the thing, you can believe what you want to believe in, like you can believe that we should liberate Palestine, and that you can even believe, as the Hezbis believe, like you can have a khilafah, we want to establish it. But the moment that you materially commit to the undermining of the West and materially support non-aligned political organizations outside of the West, you're in trouble.
You're in trouble.
Yeah,
you're in trouble. It's kind of it's something which the British did, actually, which was very interesting. What the British did this amazing thing in the so this idea of Sharia courts. So the idea of Sharia courts never existed in the Muslim world. It was actually something which was created by the British. So what the British said, look, we're going to rule, but you guys can have your own Sharia courts. So you guys, when you want divorces, you can go to the Sharia court. When you want your inheritance, you go to the Sharia court. So within that parameters, fine, you can be a Muslim. But the minute where you want the hukuma to be different, that's when we will
exactly
very quickly cut you down and take you and completely. And this is what they're still doing. It's still very much the case in the West, wherein you can have these nice little things. You can have your little mosques, and you can have your little community iftar dinners, and getting everybody to come, and etc. etc. But the minute where you try to pop your head above the parapet, as you say, that's when
you think about it, this is the epitome and the heightened. It's the logical outcome of secularism. Because often we think secularism is a separation of church and state, which it partly is, but it's more than that. It's the secularizing of the way we behave, the way we believe. So you can personally believe in whatever values you want, to have your own religious axioms and principles and communal space, and even be political within the small sphere of the private. But to be political at the state level, to engage and to say that Islam plays a role in shaping the ummah, then that's you're breaking a contract for them, right?
That's always been a trend. I mean, you've studied Western philosophy. When you look at the concept that when Rousseau was talking about the free man and the private man and the public man, and this idea that the private man and the public man, the difference between the two. When you're private, you can discuss however you wish. However, when you're public, you need to ensure that the law of the land, as we say per se, is being respected and is being focused, and you can't challenge that. But it's more than just faith. It's also anything. It's anything which challenges that.
That's what freedom is. Freedom is, you're free within the cage. You can free to do what you want within certain boundaries, and the boundaries are often defined by the political elite, right?
This, we could talk about this forever. I mean, I just want to kind of, because a lot of our listeners, viewers, they will not be so much into what we're discussing, because this is obviously, I studied history, so this is very much in my line, and I'm very keen on this. So kind of coming back to kind of our viewers who are mostly here for kind of the literature part of things, and I think most of it kind of, most of the questions I've put, you kind of answered them already. But I wanted to get your thought process, because everybody's different, and we can take some from everybody. But how do you start or come up with the idea to write and the subjects you write about? How do you start that process? I know it's a big jump from, but we kind of
it's fair. Yeah, sure. It's a good question. I wanted to talk back. I wanted to speak back. So and the way I knew how and the way I wanted is to write. Writing, I believe in what some may call a slow ontology. And what I mean by that is writing slows you down a bit. Writing, when you sit there, can be a quite necessary and lonely and needed break where you're struggling with yourself. And one of the struggles was to write the book. So coming to the process, it was quite, I didn't know how, every time I wrote something, a few pages, half a chapter, and saw it made progress, there was always this voice in me somewhere, an unease. No. And then I'd delete it all and throw it in the bin and all the rest, right? So to answer your question about how I came to it, I'm not sure I did. I felt like a few things happened in my life where I found myself before a laptop typing, and it was there that I learned the most about what I wanted to say, learned the most about who I am, I guess. And then it became a form of recollection, remembrance, aspiration, and hope, and something. I would sometimes stare into the reflection in the laptop and not know. It was it's kind of like a 2-chair therapy where I'm talking back and forth to myself, and I do believe that that wrestle you have with words, or putting around, placing it, is an important political exercise, and a way when, inshallah, that you are granted coherency and a way to put things together, then there is a small victory, I think, for you and your reader. The thing about my book is that I never really spoke to other academics. I didn't want to. This is the thing where I don't. You asked me what department I work in. I really don't like academia. I got to be honest with you. I'm there because it's sometimes a privilege, but most of the time it's a space. But I wanted to speak to other Muslims when I wrote that book, and the most successful that I felt is when many contact me and say, you put words to some of my thoughts. You articulated something that I felt, and I felt that, I spoke that, and I guess that's part of the literary tradition for me, is to take atmospheres, moments, histories, shared collective consciousnesses, manifested, put it in a word, and it becomes a shared reference and language for us to. And as I mentioned to you at the start, it's all about the experience. And so one of the things that I saw my book as was imagine ourselves, to use an analogy, our bodies as a sponge, our minds as a sponge. We've absorbed all of the September 11 and the war and terror and the othering and the hope, the aspirations, the fear, and the writing is just rinsing free that sponge and allowing all of what we have trapped inside to manifest into conversation.
It's very freeing. I think I've spoken to authors before, and I think one thing that I got to is very freeing, almost like the word was bursting to come out. And when it finally came out, you felt a lot lighter, and like a burden has been lifted almost. I would just before that, and then we'll do it kind of last statement from you in an advice for the generations, for in particular my generation. But before that, the importance of reading and the importance of projects such as ILS, wherein we are promoting reading within the Islamic culture. We are the people who made the West read. The West stopped reading. We made them read again through the translation movement. Plato reads better in Arabic than in English. But however, we are no longer a community that reads.
It's a tragedy. It's a tragedy. I will, sorry to interrupt you, because I feel quite strong about this. I read every day. For me, I will not, I can't imagine life without books. I don't know what that would mean. I have to read. and I'll have to listen. Even audiobooks now, I have to put, like, if I'm driving around, I'm like, it's a spare 40 minutes drive. Let me consume. Let me, right. So, but the privilege of opening a book, reading it, getting through it, subhanallah. So that's on a personal level. Now, the political level, as I mentioned, way back down, not only is it an articulation and the practice of what you mentioned about tradition and the fact that we should hold dearly the fact that this is a practice that Muslims have championed and in many ways, as you mentioned, reinvigorated civilizations by that practice. But also, there is no scope for us to not be politically, philosophically, or literate. There's no scope. The conversation is moving so quickly, and there's so much misinformation. And we spoke about confidence. One decolonial act of removing the mask is to build a sense of who you are, where you've come from, or what you know, and to know the other, to know your surroundings, to know who you're talking to. And a book sometimes is an insight into that, and 10 books is 10 insights, and 100 is 100 insights, and they build conversations. And I love the crackling of a book. I love opening up. I love the turning of the pages. I love the candle and the light when I'm there before. And I remember when I was doing my PhD, I'd literally walk around it with a book in my hand almost always. So we have lost that art. We've lost the audio-visual, social media generation doesn't have the attention span as much as it used to.
No.
It's very hard. They can't get through pain.
It's just, on that sense, when you said you always read, there's a quote by Machiavelli that always is very a beautiful quote from him. He says that during the day he toils in the land because he was in exile. He toils in the land, and then during the night he takes off his garment and he puts on royal garments, and he enters his study and he enters into conversation with the previous scholars of the past, and he starts talking to them, and they talk to him, and he asks of them, and they ask of him, and we have this. I mean, if you pick up a book of tafsir, you're having At-Tabari, you're having Ibn Kathir, you're having all this, and they're all discussing and talking to one another. And it will be a shame if we do lose this. We do need to start reading again. Are we expecting any more publication from you?
Yes, I changed careers, so I had a bit of but yes, I will be, inshallah, writing. I am writing. I write every day. It's, as I said, I'm slowly exiting academia at university and moving into a different arena. So I will be writing books around that.
Whatever you do, may Allah put khair in it. Is there any last statement you would like to say to our viewers?
Barakallah feek for your invitation and hosting me. And
thank you for having us.
Inshallah. Good luck to West Ham in the Europa League.
Yes. Well, it's West Ham. It's fantastic what we're doing, and thank you so much for coming. On that note, I would like to, inshallah, wrap it up. Just a reminder to our viewers, the importance of what we talked about. One of the larger part of it is the importance for us to read. Sometimes we get bogged down into, the first commandment that Allah Jalla wa Ala gave to us was to read. And the ILS is one of the organizations that is promoting and is asking us to read more. Please, if you could even, don't forget to have our monthly reading club, where we'll be reading text every month, and we'll be discussing it in the groups. And also do not forget to check our recently published book, Chain. Thank you for joining us. Barakallahu fikum. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.